like to introduce now Wilton Littlechild, former Commissioner of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. He's a Cree Canadian lawyer with vast experience of working to advance Indigenous rights, for instance, within the United Nations. He's been a member of Parliament and a North American representative to the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, among many other things. Very welcome, Wilton.
Thank you very much. Nigangakio Sametinget tatamskat nao. Igo kumstaiki goyo taheo pinama kinketon Sami. I just bring you greetings in my language as a chief of my tribe to honor the traditional keepers of these territories and the owners, the Sami peoples and Sapmi, and all of you, the dignitaries, for this opportunity to share a continuing story that Paulette gave us earlier before the break. I took a different slide actually to present this afternoon, but I think basically it involves the same story in a way about our commission that we started, the three of us, after the first set of commissioners had resigned. We were appointed, and then we began our work with an official new start by the Governor General of Canada, then Her Excellency Michaëlle Jean. The importance of our work in terms of how we went about the work, I think, is what I wanted to refer to. First of all, to underscore the importance of survivors' inclusion and involvement. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada was very much survivor-driven. It was driven by a guidance of our survivors, those that were still alive. As you saw this before the break, there were 80,000 survivors still alive when we began our work, but today there's approximately 60,000 that are left that experienced this. As you heard, I'm a Cree from the Treaty 6 territory in Western Canada. I was taken when I was 6 years old. So just imagine now, if you close your eyes, imagine yourself at 6 years of age. And you're used to having your parents, perhaps like in my case, grandparents, taking care of you. And you're enjoying life as a little boy or a little girl. Then you're taken from your parents or from your guardians, your grandparents. And you're put into an institution for 10 months. And during those 10 months, you might become lonely. You might become homesick. You might want to see your mom and dad, but you're not allowed. As a little boy or a little girl, maybe you want to cry, but you're not allowed to cry. Maybe you want to speak to someone in your language, but you're going to be punished if you do that. At 6 years of age, 7 years of age. What happens to a child when you do that to them? Well, we see that in the streets, in our communities, in the cities, where people are homeless. They have addictions, alcohol, or drugs. What happens to the parents from whom you've taken the children? We heard parents speak and say, you know, we had happiness in our home. We heard our children were running and having fun in the house, making noise as children will, sometimes fighting, sometimes crying, children. But there was noise in the home. Then all of a sudden, in September, there's no noise. There's no noise in the home of children. So parents told us that's why, in order to deal with our pain of losing our children, because we couldn't protect them, if we tried to protect them, we could be put in jail. And some parents went to jail trying to protect their children. So, to hide or try to deal with that pain or anger, we turned to alcohol or we turned to drugs. We couldn't stand the noise being gone for 10 months. What happens to the children that come after? The intergenerational trauma that happens in the family. So you're 6 years old, you're 7 years old, and you're put into this institution. The purpose, you're told, is education. But we know from records, in fact, from the Prime Minister's apology in Canada, when he said the purpose of this policy is to kill the Indian in the child. Kill the Indian in the child. So, you punish them when they try to speak their language. You punish them if they dare to wear the clothing that you're wearing today, Sami people. You'd be punished. In fact, it would be taken away from you. The first day of school, your name is changed. My name was Mahikan Mohtio. In English, that means walking wolf. My Christian name is Wilton Littlechild. My school name was number 65. So for months and years, that was my name. 65, come here. 65, pick that up. 65, why did you do that, you dummy? 65, don't you anything? So you lose your identity. You lose your pride of who you are. I am Cree. But I was a child. No longer was my name Willie or Wilton. It was 65. What happens to a child when you do that to them? Take away their traditional clothing. Take away their language by punishing them. So we were tasked by the result of a lawsuit, as Paulette mentioned, to find out what happens. So we went about the country doing our work. We actually issued 3 reports. We did an interim report early, 2 years after our mandate of hearings. One of the first conclusions that we made was this policy of removing children from their parents with the purpose of killing their spirit was actually a direct assault. It was an assault on languages, indigenous language. It was an assault on family, because you separate the family. It was an assault on our community. It was an assault on our culture. So we grew up like that. So for 10 months, for 10 years, sometimes you couldn't go home. I couldn't go home. I longed for my parents to see me. I was asked 2 days ago when I gave this presentation, tell us about your mother. That was a strange question, I thought. But in the question period, they asked, tell us about your mother, and I couldn't. I don't know my mother. I know her name. I know who she is. To see her, she's now, of course, passed on. But I didn't know her as a mother. I didn't know my dad as a dad. Because that's the impact of a policy like this, to separate children from parents. So we gave a report on how children were separated from their parents. So we wrote a book on, they came for the children. As I said yesterday, September came to be known as Crying Month. Because in many little villages and communities, you could hear the children cry as they were taken away. And that's the last you heard from them. Many of them didn't come home. We wanted to keep this memory alive, so a Commemoration Project was established that you heard about. Nobody cares for me, people said. Who's going to believe me? No one will believe me. I've told this story 7 times and no one believes me, they said. So we did a publication of survivors and their stories. This was a court-ordered commission, as you heard Paulette say. So one of the orders by the court was to not only gather the truth, but to have a national research center where she currently works. That was established. It was important to encourage the survivors to continue speaking, even though it was hard. I said yesterday, many couldn't tell us what happened to them. But they said, I will sing you a song. I will do a poem. I will write a book. I will do a tape, an audio tape. It hurts me too much to tell you, but I will tell you in a blanket. I'll make a blanket. I will paint a painting. So all these different ways that we've gathered the truth is now at the National Research Center. But what I wanted to share with you, as you heard, that we did 94 calls to action. And what were the main learnings from those 94 calls to action? We were told by the court to do a history of the schools. So we have 2 volumes of that complete history of the schools in Canada. They started in the late 1800s, but they closed in 1996. That was the last time the school closed, or one of the residential schools. We did a project on the missing children. While this was not a court order, we did it anyway because we heard about what happened to those children that were taken or sent to school and never came home. Where did they die? How did they die? Where are they buried? So now we've done a partial report because this is ongoing work about missing children. I told a story yesterday for me because it's still in my mind of seeing 4 little boys hanging on to each other, frozen to death because they tried to run away from school. Sometimes 2,500 miles from school, trying to run away from the abuse, from the physical, the mental, cultural, spiritual, and as you heard, the worst of all, sexual abuse. This was about children and what adults did to children when they were in these schools. So we did our report into those main themes. We did one on education, on culture and language, and how important culture and language is today for treatment and healing. About spirituality, because we were told we were heathens and we were not Christians. We were pagans. So our spirituality was attacked. And it's important for self-identity and self-esteem to be able to connect with Creator in your own language. All people tell us that we have our language so we can communicate with Creator. We talk about the health and justice as solutions going forward. What can we do there? We talk about poverty, the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in Canada. We called for a public inquiry into that situation. I remember when I raised this issue at the United Nations, and the number then was only, I know 1 is too many, but it was 250. Now it's 1,200, according to police records. Some say it's as high as 3,000. Women are still missing. Girls are still missing. Indigenous women and girls. Child welfare today is worse than it was at boarding school days. Child apprehension, the removal of children from parents is still going on in Canada today. But what do we do with this truth? Well, you heard Paulette talk about reconciliation. What does that look like? Well, we have 10 principles of reconciliation after 6.5 years of work and testimony in different ways. We feel that the UN Declaration must be looked at and used as a framework for reconciliation. Secretary General Ban Ki-moon said the same thing. High Commissioner for Human Rights, His Excellency, called on Canada for speedy adoption of our report. That First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples in Canada have constitutional and treaty rights that must be honored and respected. That reconciliation is a process of healing relationships. And as you heard all the previous speakers talk about truth and truth sharing, public truth sharing, and how important it is. Indeed, that it's a right to know. It's important, as you heard about apology, to be given. Prime Minister of Canada apologized to the students. And you know what? Some refused that apology. They rejected it. Some said, okay, I accept your apology and I forgive you. That's important step of healing. That commemoration is also important, not to allow this story to die, that 50 years from now, no one in the world, in Canada at least, should be able to say this didn't happen. These didn't exist in Canada. That it's important to redress past harms. Some say get over it, it happened a long time ago. But our elders tell us, you must know where you came from yesterday if you are to know where you are today, in order that you'll know where you're going tomorrow. So we can't just ignore the past, ignore the harm that was done. Reconciliation requires action to address destructive impacts. Words and nice words are no longer good enough. We need action. So we talk about areas where action is necessary. We need to close the gaps in the society. We know, for example, in Canada, Indigenous children are now 28 years behind in education. So we need to close that gap. We know that we're filling up the hospitals with our different illnesses. So we need to heal that. We know that our prisons, the majority population is Indigenous in the prisons. Some 65%, 67%, as high as 85% of the prisons are Indigenous inmates. So we need to close those gaps, the economic gaps as well. And an important principle that we think, and is starting to catch hold in Canada, is that Canadians must also think of themselves as treaty peoples. Because treaty is not a one-way street. It takes two people, two nations to make a treaty. So now you're seeing and hearing that in Canada. People acknowledging, non-Indigenous people acknowledging that they're treaty. And it's important for mutually respectful relationships. The importance of Indigenous elders and knowledge keepers in this journey on reconciliation. Because we have practices in the past of reconciliation that are important to consider going forward today. That Aboriginal or Indigenous cultural revitalization is a key to our success. And we need to integrate that in our schools. In our knowledge systems, our oral histories and laws and protocols must be included in education. You heard that from Paulette this morning, that there's curriculum change now, or this afternoon, curriculum change happening to make sure in all the schools in Canada that this history is now taught for all students in all schools. That they must now learn about the residential school history. They must learn about Indigenous peoples and the treaty relationship. The connection to land, the special connection to land. You know, yesterday and today, we talked with your president, and he talked about hunting and fishing and trapping, the sacred relationship we have with the land. You see, when you were taken from your parents, you were not only taken from your parents, you were taken from the land. And in order for us to heal, and in order for us to reconnect with culture, we need to reconnect with the land. Our elders say that's essential for reconciliation. Reconciliation will require political will. And we heard yesterday some question about that. How much should the political leadership be engaged in this process? Well, it's essential on both sides, the non-Indigenous political leadership and the Indigenous political leadership. It's going to take all of us working together in this area. That reconciliation is required for a sustained public education. As one of the speakers said this morning, I think it was Patrick, when he opened, he said, this is not the end, this is actually the beginning of your discussion. For us, it's the beginning of reconciliation. The Commission has finished its work. It's the end of it, but it's only the start of reconciliation. So we need dialogue and youth engagement. It was so important for me to see your youth representatives were here, because they're the ones who will inherit this. In Canada, we have a Prime Minister who now says this publicly. No relationship is more important to me and to Canada than the one with Indigenous peoples. He says that quite regularly to keep Canada engaged in reconciliation. It's a time for renewed nation-to-nation relationships, but it's based on 4 elements. Recognition of rights. You heard Paulette say this was a key part of our report, that is rights-based approach. It's based on respect, one of our sacred teachings, cooperation and partnership. He went further and he assigned this work to the Minister of Indigenous and Northern Affairs. It's a responsibility now of the Minister to continue this engagement on nation-to-nation basis. In all areas of interest, whether it's housing, employment, health, very importantly, mental health care, community safety, policing, child welfare, education. In all those areas now, it's her mandate to work in that. But even more importantly, to support that work by continuing the reconciliation process that we started. Begin by implementing the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So there's political engagement at the federal level, and now there's also at the provincial level political engagement, because we have a premier who said this recently. I'm here to announce on behalf of Canada, we're now a full supporter of the declaration. And it's without qualification, because you remember Canada voted against this at the UN. We've got the provincial premier saying that at its heart, the UN Declaration encourages all of us to celebrate and preserve Indigenous cultures. Quickly, here's my school. I mentioned it yesterday, but for those that weren't there yesterday, this is where I spent 11 years of my life. At one time, it was the largest residential school in Canada. We had over 500 children in here. And there's different buildings, one for the girls and one for the boys. But one of these good things that happen in school, because people sometimes ask me, well, how come you got to be a member of parliament? How come you're a lawyer? How come you've worked in 34 countries when you were abused like children in that building? Well, for me, it was sports. Hockey was one of them. You'll see that handsome guy at the back row, the second guy. That's me when I was a little guy. The same guys at a World Cup. Unfortunately, this game was in Germany, and Sweden beat us for the gold medal. But later on, the Edmonton Oilers acknowledged the residential school survivors. Freddie, number 21, was the first Indian to play in the National Hockey League, residential school survivor. I on the left played 12 years, began with the Boston Bruins. His brother held the world record for the 3 fastest goals in hockey, 20 seconds. These are residential school survivors. This is the same school. But I wanted you to see there's a fence in front. And I said yesterday, it's a barbed wire fence. But people say, get over it. But that was an electric fence. This is an electric fence in front of that school that kept us in there as children. So when people say get over it, it's kind of difficult for people like me to forget quite easily what happened to me as a child. Because I too was physically abused. I too was mentally abused. I too was sexually abused. So it's not easy to say, okay, I forgive you, let's move on. But the good thing is, this is just the beginning. And reconciliation will require leadership and sustained efforts like you're doing. Your leadership has to be sustained in order for true reconciliation to happen. So it's going to continue to call on us to work together. With that, thank you very, very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Willie. It was very emotional and I think very good for us to hear your story, and thank you for sharing this.
Thank you.
Any questions from the audience? I can start. I was wondering, when you're talking about healing, the healing, of course, the TRC as a healing process. How could you expand a bit on that? Because from the stories that you share with us here, of course, I think many of us feel, both personally and for you, in these stories. How is it possible to heal through a truth and reconciliation process? Is it possible?
I think it's possible indeed. It's very necessary. And as many people told us, that for them, it was important they go back to their culture, to have that spiritual base through the culture in order to heal. I told a quick story about an old man who told us, if you want to heal, go back to the bush, he said. Put tobacco in 4 areas, 4 directions, and offer a thanksgiving and talk to the tree. But if you really want to heal, listen to the tree. Listen to the sound of the leaves that are singing to you. Then you'll begin to heal. And it's really necessary that we heal from this harm and this hurt to our people. If we don't begin to heal, you'll continue seeing us in jails. You'll continue seeing us in hospitals. So we need to heal through our culture as one area of treatment. And yes, it is possible. I'm seeing it now today in our communities. That's what's really encouraging, to see healing happening in our communities, because people for the first time have been able to come forward and tell what happened to them as children. So the healing has started in our communities in a real good way.
Thanks, and thank you again, Wilton. I'm a little bit curious about, well, there's been so many horrific things happening in these institutions, and you and most people who work with this have had such an incredibly positive tone and so much optimism and focus on healing. Has there been any cry out for punishment for perpetrators? Has there that kind of discussion also been a part of what's been happening during the TRC process?
Yes, there has been, and it's also very important that we allow that expression of request to happen. I remember one community, for example, in a very strong voice, the community said, "We want Canada charged for genocide for what they did to us." But unfortunately, in our mandate, we didn't have enough authority to make judgment, but we could lay out the facts of what happened, and people can determine whether it was genocide or not. And as I said yesterday, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Canada has identified what happened to us as children and concluded that without a doubt, this was at least cultural genocide. So there was a cry for punishment of the state for doing that. The churches also, people say, "I will never go back to that church for what they did to me as a child." One man said, "You know, when I was a little boy, 10 years old, I took my heart and I put it at the bottom of the stairs of this church, and I walked away and I left my heart there. I got lost. And as an adult man, I came back and I picked up my heart and put it in my body again, because it was important that I forgive so I can move on as a man." Yes, there was call for punishment, but there was also call for help to heal and to be able to forgive. So it was both ways.
Over here.
Thank you, and thank you, Wilton. I think we've all been very inspired and moved by your words these 2 days. Yesterday, during our roundtable, you mentioned that in the process of collecting the interviews and speaking to people, survivors, you had a method where you didn't refuse anyone who wanted to tell their story. Could you elaborate a bit on that and tell us more of how you worked with collecting the stories from the survivors?
Yes, this part of our work was unique in a way. For example, you heard the previous presentation talk about subpoena documents or subpoena witnesses to testify in front of you. Ours was totally voluntary. So while there were some parts of our society, the indigenous community especially, not everyone accepted this process. Some felt left out of it. So they said, "I'm not going to go to that Truth Commission." But we couldn't say, "Stay away," or we couldn't say, "We can't hear from you because you represent the church. We can't hear from you because you represent the police. We can't hear from you because you represent the legal system." No, we left it completely open to anyone and everyone who wanted to come forward. So we did hear from some perpetrators, actually. Not many, but we did. We heard from representatives of the church. We heard representatives from government. And of course, we heard from many, many survivors. And I should say that they were not all bad stories. They were not all negative stories. We also had some uplifting, humorous sometimes, but really serious, positive messages in the hearings. So it was important that we try to get both the negative side and the positive side to balance, in a way, the truth. So we left it open completely to anyone. We heard from children, actually. Children that came forward of parents who had gone to residential school. So we heard them. We heard from an elderly woman, 94 years old, and she came forward. So we didn't exclude anyone in our process at all.
Thank you very much for your presentation. We will continue with the program and
Thank you. Hi, can I ask them? No, thank you.